Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from here. This is the 7th webinar in the Resilience Matters series. My name is John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be here and hosting this with you. So before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today, and also acknowledge all the lands that you may be joining from us. There's certainly, I would really like to acknowledge and respect the wisdom that comes with living for 65,000 years with the environment in which this continent has, and I think there's certainly a lot that we can learn from the First Nations peoples of this continent. So so thank you. Before we get going, there are, or as always, there's our housekeeping. So you will remain muted and your camera will not be activated for the duration of the event. We're going to record it and we'll make it available afterwards, and it'll come through updates from AIDR. So if you're not a subscriber to updates from AIDR, subscribe and you'll be able to get the recording through the next one. Enter any questions for the speakers in the Q&A function. So rather than the chat, put it in the Q&A function so it doesn't get lost, and then we can prioritize it. You can use the chat for commentary and conversation, and we encourage that because we want this to be interactive, so for people to share their thoughts. But in sharing your thoughts and comments and questions, we also ask people to be respectful to each other, as well as to the presenters, which is important. And also recognise that some of the things that we may talk about can cause people distress. You may be triggered by some things that are spoken about. So if that does happen, please make sure you take steps to use whatever techniques you have to sort of manage stress. So with that, the Resilience Matters series is all about how we understand and manage systems. And sorry, I've just got some things going on in the background here, which you can't see, but I can. So today we're diving into an important topic, the role of local government. And that we know that that disasters take place in places, so they're the intersection of hazards with communities in a place. We know that local government is the level of government that's most influential over the places that people live, work and play. They're closest to citizens and residents. In Australia, we've got 534 local governments across the country, with the majority of them being in rural, regional and remote areas, around 55%. Equally though, urban councils have an increasing range of complex and interconnected hazard risks, with many people exposed in much denser areas. Traditionally, local government's role has really been seen as roads, rates and rubbish, and many, if you kind of check the comments section on council's Facebook, you'll see a lot of people still think that's what they should be doing. But the role of local government as a service deliverer, as a community builder and an economic developer has certainly expanded over the years. The role of local government in emergency management varies across the country, from formal lead roles, places like Queensland, through other states where it might be a sort of supporting role. When we think about disasters systemically, we see risk and consequences across social, built, natural, cultural, political, economic and human domains. Local governments, when we sort of look at these domains, we see that local government have this impacts in kind of a lot of the roles that they play, whether it's in provision of childcare, community development, managing roads and infrastructure or planning, libraries, economic and business development. So we can see that these complex systemic consequences do play out in a lot of the different areas that local government work in. So rather than me sort of kind of babble on about this, I want to invite our two speakers who are more expert in this area and talk about local government. Before we get to that, popped up a couple of questions there for you to be thinking about as we go through today. We want you to be able to kind of walk away starting to think about what you hear today and how you might apply that. Right, enough from me. Let's go. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today, Gemma Edwards from Bega Valley Shire Council and Jason Collins from the Maribyrnong City Council. Our first speaker today is Gemma Edwards. She's the Strategic Initiative Lead at the Bega Valley Shire Council. Over to you, Gemma.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, John, for the introduction. My name is Gemma Edwards, and I am the Strategic Initiatives Lead at Bega Valley Shire Council, as John just shared. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the pathway to embedding resilience that we've taken here. So the first slide on the screen, I'm not going to keep up too long, and anybody who works in or around local government, though it might not seem immediately obvious, I think you'll be very familiar with this environment. Basically, this was a map that I tried to make when I was trying to understand the factors at play when we make decisions in local government and all of the emergence between different factors as they move throughout the system. Can you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So looking at that, I started to think a little bit about the fact that in that environment, decisions are not made external to or off to the side. So it started off as a pestle analysis, and you pretty quickly realize that political and social factors are not externalities to the decisions that we make in local government. They kind of characterize the system that we operate within. And so this is when I started thinking about the politics of planning. Decisions that we make aren't neutral, and the plans that we produce aren't apolitical. They are decision-making outputs, and they decide what is feasible, or the process that happens is how we decide what is feasible for our communities. And when we think about that in terms of resilience building, it becomes pretty clear how that plays out. So with something like resilience, it's not as tangible as something like waste services, for example, where you can go and pick up a bin, take the rubbish away, and the job is done. It's a little bit more difficult to try and conceptualize what resilience does and whose job it is to do resilience. How much doing they become responsible for? What is actually required to do resilience and what we should be focusing on? Where, why, and when do we focus our resources? And what happens when a disaster strikes? Can we please go to the next slide? Okay, so everybody who's worked in local government will be familiar with resilience building and the complex environment that we operate within. The good news is that through the work that we've done here, I would like to think that we have a lot more agency in our complex environment than what it initially feels like when we're trying to understand how those complexities come together and result in a big long list of things that we could do to build resilience as an organisation. Can we please move on to the next slide? I should just say next slide, shouldn't I? So for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about the journey that we've taken at Bega Valley Shire Council so far. Last year, when we spoke at the conference in Perth, I went a little bit over the Enabling Resilience Investment pilot project, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But I want to move us along to the yellow spots on the screen and start talking a bit more about the journey that we've taken since that point in August last year. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Enabling Resilience Investment Project was a pilot project delivered at Bega Valley Shire Council in partnership with the CSIRO and Value Advisory Partners. It was a successful project. We had $1.5 million from the New South Wales government, and it was 5 workshops over a year and a half with about 50 stakeholders across different sectors and also internal to the organisation. And what we ended up with was a list of investment cases for the most resilient interventions in the transport network within the Bega Valley Shire Council, which was a success, and that was the outcome that we were after. However, thinking about that complex decision-making environment that we were just talking about, the difficulty really came into trying to understand what do we do next with those list of interventions. So some of you may have experienced this before where you have some kind of resilience building focus and you end up with a laundry list of things that you could be doing on top of the things that you're already doing. And so when we're trying to embed resilience into our decision-making processes, how are we weighing up an approach, or how are we using an approach like the Enabling Resilient Investment approach to try and balance criticality and make decisions about what should be progressed when it's a complex environment and everything's important and everyone needs everything all the time. Next slide, please. Okay, so we finished the Enabling Resilience Investment and everybody was asking what now? So it was a project that was run over a year and a half, and I think the difficulty with trying to do resilience in a project-based kind of approach is that the project ends, but the need for resilience doesn't. And so we finished that. We did a bit of analysis on what we should try and do next. I should mention as well, if you're interested in learning more about the embedding resilience, there are a couple of links that talk about a case study, linked to a handbook, and also some context around what that was, which I think will be provided afterwards. But we finished that project and we went and we interviewed all of the managers, the executives, some people at officer level and coordinator level. And I asked them if we were doing resilience, if this was to become our business as usual, this approach, then what would it look like? We also looked at a couple of different inputs. So the community satisfaction survey, some interest or some kind of priority areas for the councillors, and just doing a bit of an environmental scan around what were priorities for state and federal governments too, and where we might need to try and get funding for things that we needed to do. Anyway, we ended up with these 3 objectives across different operational environments within the organisation. So you can see the objectives on the screen. Next slide, please. But outside of having the objectives, we then needed to try and achieve them. So it would be really cool in change management if we could do that freeze thing that people used to talk about. We could just stop everything from happening and just kind of like bring it back to the start and just start fresh. But unfortunately, we can't do that. And we need to keep delivering services while we're also trying to improve and reassess where resources go. So we developed a program of change with the objectives. And then we had to kind of identify the current state, which was where that program came from, and figure out how we were going to move to the future state, which was adaptive, responsive, connected, proactive. And we broke it up in phases that reflect the Enabling Resilience Investment pilot. So the enabling, the embedding, and the improving. And then we broke it up even further. So as part of this process, we delivered a workshop that was called the Priorities Workshop. And we basically took that laundry list of stuff that we were talking about before, resilience actions, but also the laundry list of stuff that's just in the regular delivery plan, and the objectives, and tried to figure out where we should prioritize putting resources if we were going to try and achieve the future state. Could we please, next slide? So we ended up with this future state operating model, which is essentially the integrated planning and reporting framework, which is the New South Wales local government governance framework. And it's the same elements as the IPR framework, but then we kind of injected specific strategic checkpoints to try and get a clear understanding of why we were doing what we were doing, how we were going to allocate resources to do what we needed to do, and what it actually is that we were going to do, which is kind of where the project management framework came from. Can we just go back one slide? Sorry. I neglected to mention that in the priorities workshop, what we came to agree on was 6 priority focus areas. First one was governance and record keeping, customer experience, development application review, project management framework, getting shovel ready, and an asset management focus. So obviously all of those are really big things, which is why we broke them up further into different phases. And we started with governance and record keeping because the thinking behind that was if we don't have clear foundations and good basis for changing things, then none of anything else will work. And the customer experience is a really clear motivator to why we're trying to do this differently. Yes, the decision-making framework is kind of what is going to hold or be able to hold the change in future. Because if we just move to the next slide, thank you, then there's a further breakdown. So I love diagrams and there's a lot of diagrams in this. But basically, this is broken down into how a project becomes a project. So the community and the external factors kind of help us set strategic objectives. And then the resourcing available is how we decide which projects get progressed. The Depop is the delivery plan and the operational plan. And then that priorities workshop that I was talking about before is when we bring project scopes forward and try and decide whether or not those specific projects are supporting us in achieving our strategic objectives. The delivery and the reporting loops right back up to the top, as we saw in the previous decision-making framework. And if we just go to the next slide, I'm going to bring back around why I had that crazy map at the beginning. So that previous slide is in a perfect world when the budget is adopted and the delivery plan is kind of like a static tool, which is not the case. The delivery plan is a decision-making output, but the context and the conditions are always changing. And so we also have a change trigger, which sits inside that yellow part of the decision-making framework and helps us assess whether or not we have the capability, the capacity, whether or not the conditions have changed, and how we're going to respond to that. This work also loops up with previous work that's been done by the corporate strategy team and the finance team that has brought quarterly reporting and quarterly budget reviews as like key organizational checkpoints. So we're always checking in to see what's changed and how we need to adapt our approach. Can we please move to the next slide? Okay, so as part of this, it's basically a couple of different key frameworks linked together to make the governance framework. So the why is the strategic and the community engagement. The how is something like a service review framework or an organizational change management procedure to make sure that we have the right capacity, the right people, that we're doing the right things. And then the what is the project management framework and how we deliver projects and why we deliver projects. This is just an example of an updated workflow. So as part of this process, we also updated the project management framework. It's a pretty generic framework. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but the way projects was happening was kind of inconsistent at different times because of the breadth of services that local government deliver. So what we tried to do was bring a consistent approach to something like projects so that we could have a good baseline level of understanding of where resources were going and how they were being used so that we could feed that information right back up to the top to then kind of give us a continuous cyclical process. Can we please go to the next slide? Sorry, can we please go to the next slide? Yes, okay. So this is an example of the procedure content. This supports the workflow. So if you can just see, this is all in draft form still, but in these steps, it's really clear and upfront as to what's expected at each step, who's responsible, and what the expected outputs are going to be. I would just like to note here as well that we have designed this based on our current context and our current constraints. So we didn't have any money to get a new project framework tool. And so all of this is based on what we currently have available. And it's just about making sure that the systems and processes we have are fit for purpose. If we could just go back to the other slide. The reason why we've designed it the way we've designed it is because we took a co-design approach. So there was an understanding at an executive level or at a manager level that things weren't being kind of delivered the way they were expected to be. And this isn't just about projects specifically. This is just about a gap in like where we wanted to be and where we were, and not really understanding what the gap was or why it was happening. And so I've just used this as an example. The project management framework is just one thing. But what we did to try and understand that gap was instead of talking about governance and record keeping, because it's kind of boring and no offense, but people were not that engaged with governance and record keeping, we rebranded it to good data for good decisions. And we had a series of workshops with about 50 stakeholders from across the organisation at different levels and from different departments. And we had 3 workshops with each of those groups. And we tried to co-design a solution. So we started off with getting an understanding of the shared challenges. So if we know, for example, the project management framework currently isn't working, what's actually happening? The first one on this list is a good example. So how might we simplify and connect systems to reduce duplication? The previous project management framework wasn't clear. People maybe weren't getting the training that they needed. Co-design solution. So the next time we took it back and we said, okay, this is a consolidation of what all the separate groups said, but now in your group, what would be the solutions that you would come up with to try and solve this? So you had problem, impact, insight, and then their suggested solutions and the barriers to overcome when we were trying to implement those solutions, which was really helpful in terms of a change management perspective. And then the outcomes. Again, this is just a small snippet, but we had about 40 different solutions to try and address some of these problems. Just thinking back to earlier when we were talking about the resilience as well, we didn't just want another long laundry list of all the things we could do. So we took those solutions to the next priorities workshop, which we had in January this year, and then kind of apportioned those solutions to different departments so that the improvement was still happening. It wasn't just one person's job to do resilience, but we were taking an organizational approach while also making sure that the solutions and the problems we were trying to address, while we were trying to make sure the solutions we were trying to implement were actually solving the problems that we wanted to address. Next slide, please. Okay. It's actually quite hard to try and consolidate 2 years of work down. But anyway, what's next is this is ongoing. There needs to be a lot more work in this. We need a plans and strategies review. So we just need to make sure that all of the plans and strategies that we currently have kind of been developed in a similar way. Which is difficult. Actually, I saw this anecdote on LinkedIn a little while ago, and it was talking about a local government executive was talking to someone who worked in a private sector and the challenges they were facing. And the person in the private sector said, well, if it was me, I would just break them up into different businesses, which would be good in theory, but in local government, we deliver so many different kinds of services that we kind of just have to make it work. So plans and strategies review, obviously we're not all addressing the same things, but we're responding to the same strategic objectives and we're considering the same things. And the resourcing actually considers what the different plans and strategies need as well. And it also considers resilience and improvement, because if BAU takes up 80% of our capacity. We've only got 20% left over to try and do improvements. So where are we going to focus that 20% to make sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, which is where those ongoing improvements to service review frameworks, change management, and decision-making frameworks will continue. However, next slide, please. It would also be good if the environment changed. So I really don't like the answer that it's just the way local government is, and we just have to be reactive because we're just kind of, at the bottom of the chain, and I don't know, I don't want to be apathetic about the conditions that local government operate within. But it would be really cool if we could have flexible and adaptive funding structures and some reform and systemic changes in how local government operates. But ultimately a mindset and a motivation and a behavioural change, because my perspective is that if we don't change how we value things and the motivation behind why we do what we do, we're going to continue to perpetuate the conditions that we find ourselves in the first place. So that's me finished. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Gemma, for a fantastic presentation and sort of unpacking the complexity of resilience and resilience investment, and sort of trying to move away from that laundry list approach, which I think we're all so familiar with and sort of probably weighed down by. I should have added at the start, the Bega Valley is in the southeast of New South Wales and has had significant impacts from not only the bushfires in 1920, which some of us call Black Summer, but also the Tathra fire. So it's a community that has been well and significantly exposed to hazard and disaster. So this project takes place in that sort of context and understanding the need for resilience and greater effort in risk reduction. So I want to move now from southeast New South Wales and bring a more urban focus. I want to welcome Jason Collins, who's the Coordinator of Emergency Management at Maribyrnong City Council here in Naarm or Melbourne in the western suburbs, quite diverse and complex area of Melbourne. So over to you, Jason, to give us another quite different perspective.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and offer my respects to Elders of the Lands and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples past, present and future. So John mentioned it before, roads, rates and rubbish. It's a phrase we all know well, it's simple, it's memorable, and it's very misleading, as mentioned. Slide, please. Yes. Today, I want to talk about the fact that this expanded role for, councils is not incidental. It's structural and it should be recognised more appropriately. And that recognising it appropriately is one of the biggest challenges facing emergency management's future, especially if we want to improve outcomes for our communities before, during and after emergencies. And I guess at this point, I'm either making sure I can't get a job back in state government, but I want to make a couple of observations. I don't think at the present moment our state and federal emergency management arrangements and systems are fit for purpose when you look at the local first, philosophy people are trying to do. And then also another observation is that why local government will be a lead agency for innovation in emergency management into the future. I guess firstly, I just probably need to start with reframing. The tradition 3 R's reflect the visible and transactional side of local government. But council also operates often quietly and without recognition across another set of R's, which is the response, recovery and resilience areas. Taken together, it's basically 6 R's is probably more accurate, describes the public value that councils create, particularly in the disaster space. It also explains why local government sits somewhat uncomfortably within the emergency management systems that were never actually designed to reflect this reality. So, firstly, state and federal emergency arrangements are, in many respects, highly capable. I've worked in them. They are. They're strong on policy and legislation, command and control structures, specialist response capability, visible authority, or most times in crisis. And these systems work well when an emergency is bounded, time limited, and in response and early recovery phases. But the modern disasters increasingly aren't like that. They are long running, overlapping, socially complex, traumatizing and life-changing for a lot of people, and as much about community trust as it is about the logistics, planning, sandbags and boats and trucks. Yet our governance and funding systems remain heavily weighted towards the response end and the agencies that work in that area, and a lot weaker in the areas that complement prevention, preparedness and recovery, or I like to call it the resilience movement. I guess local government is probably where this mismatch becomes quite visible. Councils are included in legislation in state and territory plans across the country and are variously described as key partners by all in the emergency management world. But in reality, when you look at it, councils often have limited authority during response and recovery. They've got limited voice in state level decision making, especially on plans that are supposedly going to be locally led or locally informed, and funding that rarely matches the duration or scope of what the responsibilities for council are. Next slide, please. Which I find interesting, because when response agencies demobilise, councils remain. When time-limited bureaucratic systems withdraw, councils are still there. And when trust needs to rebuild, and sometimes over many years, councils are expected to lead that as well. This is not because councils have been formally positioned as emergency management leaders, but because they are embedded, present, accountable in ways that no other emergency service or agency is. A central premise is that community expectations have shifted, and communities are increasingly looking for our local governments for continuity, transparency, leadership before, during, and after emergencies. I guess council's proximity to people, assets, and local systems does position us as critical actors in this emergency management space. And importantly, it's across all hazards and all phases of the PPRR. I guess practical delivery at the local level is often constrained by our current governance settings, which are designed for that command and control. Next slide. So what tensions are we actually talking about when we get into this space? I guess first we're talking about these system settings that create friction. You look at the locally led versus state controlled. It's a tension between local empowerment and centralised control, particularly during rapidly evolving events, and creates a lot of issues, especially when you look at debriefs. We can look at things like process versus person. You know, systems optimised for data, documentation, reporting and assurance that actually take away the agency from those that are impacted and misses recovery needs, and also stops local adaptation and innovation for what's required within the community. And then if we look at a community-led versus a command and control structure, I guess community expectations for participation and transparency can clash with that hierarchical decision-making process. And I guess finally, my big one, and not reflective everywhere, but there is a representation imbalance. Councils have a limited, if no voice in state and federal committees compared with response agencies and state and federal government departments. And this affects agenda setting and resource allocation ultimately. By the very makeup, these state and territory level committees are ultimately a bias, with representation, when there is representation for local government, is token and usually via a proxy such as a state government department on its behalf or an advocacy group. Now, I know everyone will say that, but imagine if all our emergency services agencies could only have one rep at their state committee, not the 5 or 6 that represent the different agencies with lights and sirens. I know, it's a paradox. Councils are one of the very few organisations that operate across all hazards and across all phases. If we look at prevention, it's through our planning, our land use and other mitigation activities. It's preparedness through community development and local networks, response through staff, assets, facilities, local intelligence. You know, our people are on the front line as much as any emergency service. They're in the smoke, they're in the rain, they're in the floods. And then recovery, as we all know, through a sustained and a place-based leadership model. In other words, council already function as all hazards whole cycle organisations. Despite this, traditional emergency management arrangements treat the specialist response agencies and command and control operating models as the norm. While effective during that response phase, as mentioned, they're less well suited to prolonged and complex emergencies. Communities frequently depend on the capabilities that sit outside our traditional frameworks and frequently depend on councils' capabilities and assets and local knowledge to help meet those needs. Councils regularly assume the roles and responsibilities, and blame, let's face it, for things that sit outside of the emergency agency's jurisdictions or a state agency or state arrangement's failure. And councils have no choice in that. It's our community, so we must do it. But shouldn't then the arrangements actually reflect this leadership? The arrangements and systems that treat council, and that can either be by design or purpose, but usually it's a byproduct, as peripheral or subservient to other agencies, are no longer fit for purpose. It is a public value reform, and it is grounded in, I guess, local empowerment, decisions being made as close as possible to the people affected by institutions that understand local context and relationships and risks. So we really do want to see a formalising, acknowledging and an elevating of the role to local government, because it's not just about an efficiency reform. Next slide. I guess the second part of this is probably wanting to talk and link to, I guess, council being an all-hazard agency, is why I think innovation in the emergency management sector will be increasingly led by local government, whether our system explicitly plans for it or not. This is mainly because important innovations in this space are not primarily led technologically created or created in a laboratory. Most of the, I guess, innovations that are going to occur are relational, adaptive, and most important part, local. Well, I guess local government operates at that intersection of community expectation, practical delivery, multiple hazards, and long timeframes. Again, as mentioned, we're not the single hazard agency, and we're not time-limited organisations in a place and a time during an emergency. We operate across the PPRR and other hazards simultaneously. And this creates the condition for a different form of innovation, I think. Innovation that probably looks a bit more like learning by doing, experimentation under uncertainty, adjusting approaches based on lived experience, enabling community ideas rather than directing them, and thinking about future and not what has passed. We see this when councils support locally developed initiatives. In these instances, the community leads the concept and the direction, while council provides that governance, coordination, resources, and support to enable delivery. Leaving space for creativity and innovation is therefore the role of council. It's not optional, but essential, and it also comes back to trust. It cannot be mandated, only enabled. So I'd just like to use our example here, some examples here from Maribyrnong. On October 14th, 2022, our Maribyrnong River flooded, and we had around 500 homes have over the floor inundation. And the recovery for that is still ongoing as we speak. At the start, obviously, a recovery committee was established, and after a bit of a rocky start, the CRC became, I guess, the backbone of the recovery program focused on resilience, risk reduction, and advocacy. It was about using a strengths-based model, community members-led projects aligned with their skills, creating leadership opportunities, and embedding local capacity in recovery and resilience, but importantly, innovating to meet those needs. A few of the programs and projects our community looked at: a practical insurance guidance by their national and award-winning Maribyrnong Insurance Project, which is about making the complex accessible by bringing together multiple partners and community members by telling their stories in their way. It's exceptionally powerful. If we look at risk reduction, help by coming up with property flood risk cards in partnership with the Vic SES and Melbourne Water. Each card shows the likely flood level on each individual property in the flood zone and provide guidance on warnings. I think we're at 466 at the present moment. And then even if we look at other parts of the community, it's our children's book that helps families talk about disasters and understand the risks they face. This wasn't designed by the adults, it was done by the children who are impacted by that. And we look at the social cohesion activities that the community is running through their barbecues and movies, and we've got another one coming up this Saturday. And I guess importantly, going forward and looking at the prevention side, the preparations, the preparedness side, we've got a Maribyrnong neighbourhood flood network. The community leader model was designed to overcome accessibility barriers and ensure preparedness information reached every household. It's locally tailored communication that travels through trusted networks, exactly what the UN is talking about at the moment. In these cases, the community comes up with the idea and then leads the development. And they're an amazing community, and the group hasn't finished yet by any stretch. And you will see them and some of their projects as at a conference close to you. But so how does this innovation occur? It occurs because councils enable it, again, by providing that guidance, governance, coordination, resources, and continuity. The work mentioned here above was supported and championed by council staff, by Georgia Esplin, who was ably supported by Andy Chan and Joe Scanlon, who did a lot of that support for the community, but a whole lot more as well as members of local government. And this kind of innovation cannot be centrally designed at a state or a federal level. It cannot be mandated through a framework or a 130-page guideline. And it cannot be delivered on a fixed funding timeline that focuses only on one of the PPRR parts at the exclusion of others. It's done through trust. And as mentioned earlier, trust does not operate on fixed timelines, and resilience cannot be delivered solely through predefined programs. Instead, the innovation will come from what is being made available locally via strengthened networks and done in real time. And councils are uniquely positioned to cultivate this resourcefulness because they remain present, accountable, and invested in place. Which I guess brings me back to resilience. But I'm probably going to use the words of our moderator, that resilience in practice is best understood not as robustness or resistance, but as resourcefulness, using what is available locally, strengthening those networks, adapting in real time, and preparing for emerging risks, not just the past events. We can do this because we are present and we're invested. The real system question then is not whether councils will lead innovation in emergency management and resilience. They already do that. Next slide, please. The question is whether governance, capability and funding arrangements will evolve quickly enough to support the leadership councils are already providing. And so I guess in some respects, I'm talking about community innovation, but I guess that's a talk for another time. We're talking here about local government. I guess the conclusions for me have clear implications across the board for those leading on the two conversations I've had. First, and this is a local government challenge, we need to advocate. We've got to ensure that the 3 R's are recognised more as the 6 R's. And that is on us to do that. But we also need resilience, response and recovery and design our governance accordingly so we can do that. For state government, I think there's a challenge there to elevate and formalise local government's role. There'll be an argument that it already exists, but we need to move beyond the language and the secondary status of partner to clearly recognising councils as all facets, whole cycle actors with authority, representation and escalation pathways that match their responsibilities. I think third, we need to rebalance that local empowerment versus control component. It must operate in practice, not in principle. Central agencies, and talking about Premier's departments here, should enable and assure outcomes while delegating authority where local decision-making improves the speed, relevance and trust. And that includes, I guess, financial authority, which leads to the next point, is that our funding models still remain heavily skewed towards our response phase. Recovery, prevention and preparedness require that flexible multi-year arrangements that reflect their long duration and non-linear nature of the work, especially if we're being locally led. We don't know where it's going to take us. And I guess another one for local and state is we need to start investing in our local emergency leadership capability, and that is at the executive level within councils in particular. Emergency leadership within councils should be deliberately developed through training, mentoring and exercising, rather than left to emerge only through a crisis and a who's left standing approach, as unfortunately sometimes does happen. And finally, I think I just want to say that we need to enable innovation rather than prescribing it. Our policy frameworks need to reduce unnecessary compliance for community, but also during recovery, to create space for that experimentation and resilience activities and value relational and trust building outcomes alongside the measurable outputs. I guess to conclude, local government is already doing far more than our traditional roles acknowledge, and councils are obviously maintaining the roads, rates and rubbish, unless you're here in Melbourne and we're on strike, so that's not quite happening everywhere at the moment. But we're also delivering our resilience, response and recovery. As disasters become more complex, overlapping and prolonged, we are going to increasingly depend upon, I guess, adaptive leadership rather than command and control. And local government is already leading in this space in practice and doing it in the day in, day out. The challenge now is not whether council should play more of this role, but whether our systems will formally recognise, resource and support the leadership that is already happening. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jason, for your fantastic presentation. I'll invite Jason to stay on the screen for the Q&A, and please, Gemma and John, if you could join us as well. For those who don't know me, my name is Maribyrnong, and I'm the main manager of capability development and engagement at AIDR. In the Q&A portion of the webinar. So let's turn to the Q&A window to ask some of the most upvoted questions that comes from the audience. Okay, the first questions we have here is for Gemma. From Sue. Sue is asking, she'd be interested in whether you have projects that build community capability and how you evaluate them. How do you embed community input into the official decision making?
I'm going to answer the second part of the question. We do have projects that build community capability, but that hasn't been my focus here with council. How do you embed community input into the official decision-making processes? So in the decision-making framework, the community are at the very top. Their input obviously is kind of like the reason for us being here in the first place. In the integrated planning and reporting framework, that is the community strategic plan, and there's an engagement strategy that goes behind collecting input from different community groups and community members to direct how and where we put our resources and why. So that process is the same. However, in the project management framework, there's more of an emphasis in that process on how, when, and why information is collected to direct specific projects. So it's kind of like a two-pronged process. Obviously, there's the community strategic plan, which sets those high-level strategic priorities at the CSP level. And then at specific projects too, there is engagement to make sure that those projects are responding effectively.
Thanks, Gemma. So next questions, it will be for Jason, is from Leah. So they're saying that they would love to hear your thoughts on the councils being drawn into the AIM structure outside just of the EMLO and having training and implementation internal to local government and government.
Thanks. Yeah, no, the AIM structure, it's a conversation that I guess happens everywhere. And I guess I was back at Red Cross way back in the old days where AIMS was introduced into there as a way of managing resources. And I think that's the important part of remembering why using AIMS. It's a management structure and a management, I guess, tool. It's not a command and control structure per se. I guess every structure is that. But it's actually one about how do you manage your resources and how do you move it. Decision-making is still under AIMS, left, or theoretically, left at the local level and at those on the ground in operational roles. So for councils, and we're looking at a version of that here in Maribyrnong, around, how do we get our people and move our resources and assets to where they need to be in a really time, sensitive way. And AIMS is also probably a really good way of actually recording your decision-making, which unfortunately is one of those areas that we can fall down of at the local level. So I think it can be used, but again, you need to understand what the whole system is and how it's actually supposed to be used.
Jason. So our next question is from Monica, and this is for Gemma. It's for Monica said she'd consider a way of implementing a project management program or office. So our question is, where do you address if a project is improving the resilience of your assets, programs, or community?
So again, that kind of flips back around into the top. So with the project management framework, it's just one example of one of the things that we're doing underneath the change program. But the reporting that happens, the quarterly reporting and the monthly reporting through the projects is going towards the KPIs of those specific projects as well, which in a perfect world, all the projects are responding to the strategic objectives, which were set by the community strategic plan. So where do you address if a project is improving the resilience of our assets, programs, or community? That's just through the normal project monitoring process. I guess I saw something come through before about the resilience focus, and I guess I just want to say to this question as well, is that the resilience part is in the lens of the why we do the things, and we wanted the how we do the things to be straightforward and simple and nothing kind of additional to what we're already doing, because I think that is the most difficult thing when it comes to embedding or improving resilience, is that it's sometimes seen as an additional thing rather than how and why we're operating the way that we are. So that top end of that strategic decision-making process really goes to what Jason was talking about with the not fit for purpose systems and structures. So when those objectives become the strategic objectives, and then all of our projects are responding to that to try and help us operate in the environment that we're in, I guess, yeah, it's resilience. Measuring resilience is difficult because it's intangible. And how do you measure what didn't happen? Yeah, so I guess that's my answer. I don't know if that's very clear. Sorry.
That's the answer. Thanks, Gemma. So next questions that would be for both of you. I'd like to ask Jason first. That came from this one. Let's say, how do you balance and support knowledge sharing across councils with place-based frameworks and responses? Yes, Jason.
I guess it's the same way we do knowledge sharing with communities around risk, ultimately. It's about creating opportunities and forums for people to get together and actually have those conversations. Similar to what I guess AIDR are doing with having the webinar series here, is like, getting practitioners in different councils to come and talk to other council people. It's not saying we're doing it right, it's just a version of how we think we're doing it. And I think that's probably the best way around that knowledge sharing. I think the other part is around, I guess, making sure we record what we've done. And that comes back into, I guess, the monitoring evaluation component. And I think Gemma would have seen that it's probably one of the areas that we really struggle with in emergency services, full stop. We're getting better at it. But it's it's not something that's at the forefront of any of the work that's being done usually when we see that. So I think that's our challenge there, is if we've got that monitoring evaluation, it then leads to better lessons learned, which then gives us an evidence base to then share knowledge across, I guess, different domains, and not just within each other, but with others. And I think what I was probably trying to allude to in my presentation is that we can't just share in our own silo. I guess at the present moment, it seems like we've got canisters of excellence, to steal some words from an old colleague, but what we need to do is open those canisters up and let them actually just kind of flood across each other so that the information is shared that way.
Thanks, Jason. Gemma, do we want to address this as well?
I agree. I agree with Jason. Place-based frameworks and responses. Again, I think I mentioned this with the project management framework. It's not really about reinventing the wheel. It's just about making sure that the frameworks that we have make sense in our own context, which no one can tell you what that is. But I don't necessarily think, as Jason was saying as well, that in local government we're adequately resourced to do place-based planning in a way that really moves the needle. So how do you balance it? It's just like it's hard. You kind of have to go out of your way and do additional network building and talking to people and coming along to things like this to do the knowledge sharing because it's not easy.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. Like as the question itself says, it's very place-based. Yeah. Okay, so I will close the Q&A session here and hand over to.
Thanks, Maida. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Gemma. And still a bunch of fantastic questions there that we're not able to get to, but you know, perhaps we'll look at that. So that's obviously all we've got today. But to see both looking at the strategic and the sort of more practical, tactical, I think has been a useful framing for us to sort of start to think about, you know, how do we move beyond what we have been thinking about as a local government's role. So again, I want to thank you both, Gemma and Jason, and for both your presentations, but the forthrightness that you both brought to this webinar, I think is absolutely fantastic. Jason, we might need to, if you ever need another job, we might need to help you there. But no, look, it's been really really good. So I'd like to now, just in sort of closing out, I'd like to thank Charlotte Fell and Angela Draper for their work on making this webinar possible. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the National Emergency Management Agency, who bring this resource to the forefront. When you when you leave today, you'll be taken to a short survey. Please, if you can take the time to sort of answer the questions, this really helps us in terms of making sure that we are getting our programming right. And also, if you cast your mind back to the start of the webinar, where we posed a number of those questions, just have a think about what's the one thing you're going to do when you walk away from this webinar in your work. How can you apply this to your work? We're going to take a little break from webinars over the next month because we've got a couple of other things going on. The Lessons Management Forum is in Brisbane from the 19th to the 21st of May, and tickets are on sale for that. That's going to be a fascinating and fantastic forum. As Jason said, the thing, our challenge is about learning, and so this is, I think, one of the greatest challenges for the sector. So the more that we can learn and embed, so we're not kind of reinventing the wheel. So have a think about being part of that. It's been my pleasure to host you this afternoon, and until next time, stay well.